Okay. So as I mentioned before, this session will address the primary issues that the cell therapy companies are continuing to face regards to commercialization and the continuing momentum in the sector. And will include topics such as manufacturing scale-up, assay development, logistics, and market access. So let me just start, ask you briefly to introduce yourselves, the company you're with, what you're doing, and then we'll start with some questions. Jeff?
Sure. Good morning. My name is Jeff Walsh. I am the CFO of Bluebird Bio. Excited to be here, really excited to hear certainly about the progress of ARM and the industry in the field. It is an incredibly exciting time to be a part of this evolving ecosystem. So if you don't know Bluebird, we're a company that has a focus on gene therapy and gene editing. And we have 4 products in the clinic, 3 of which focus on rare diseases. And we'll probably get into some of that, in particular the 2 that are late stage, arguably in registration trials. And then we have 1 other oncology program in the CAR T field that is targeting BCMA for multiple myeloma. We're about 320 people strong now, maybe a bit more than that because we keep adding people by the day. And we've been in the field for quite a long time. People don't know that Bluebird in its earlier manifestation was 1993. A company started in 1993. It became Bluebird in 2010. So excited to be here.
Hi, everybody. My name is Manfred Rüdiger. I'm the CEO of Kiadis Pharma, which is an Amsterdam, Netherlands-based biotech company. We're working on a cell therapy to provide curative options to patients suffering from severe acute and myeloid leukemia. I think we are the odd one out here because we're not working with gene-modified cells. We're making stem cell transplantation a safe procedure which becomes available to all in need, independent of the availability of matching donors. We have shared very strong phase 2 data recently. We're filing with the European authorities as we speak. So submission date is first quarter. And we're currently initiating and kicking off a transatlantic randomized controlled phase 3 trial of 200 patients in cell therapy. So it's a pleasure to be here and to see the industry grow.
Hi, I'm Barbra Sasu. I'm in charge of Pfizer's Allogeneic CAR T platform, and I'm also interim CSO of Renout, which is a biotech unit in the Oncology Research and Development Organization at Pfizer. We have collaborations with 2 companies to work on allogeneic CAR T, which is Selectis and Servier, and our first product, UCART19, is currently in the clinic with a second homegrown product, BCMA, also headed for the clinic in the relatively near future.
Good morning. I'm Tom Farrell, President and CEO of Bellicum Pharmaceuticals. We're a cellular immunotherapy company based in Houston, Texas. And we have 3 clinical programs. The first also in the allogeneic stem cell transplantation space, which is in essentially early pivotal trials in Europe. And then we have our first 2 CAR and TCR product candidates moving into the clinic, one targeting PSCA, and that's starting in pancreatic cancer, and the second targeting PRAME, which is expressed in a number of both hematologic and solid tumors. What's differentiated about Bellicum's approaches is the ability to control the cells after they've been administered, either to manage safety or to manage efficacy, the latter being a particular issue, as everyone knows, in the solid tumor setting.
Right, thank you, Tom. So let me start with Manfred, because your therapy from your company doesn't involve genetic manipulation of the cells, and talk a little bit about the regulatory environment, also because you've been in a number of different markets. You've been in the US, been in Europe. So can you talk about your interaction with regulatory authorities, and then we'll move into the gene therapy companies and ask the same question.
Yeah, sure. So the Kiadis has been starting its programs already quite a few years ago, and all of that started in Canada, was then expanded into Europe and also into the US. So what we did from day one on was to use the regulatory authorities as a free consultancy, if you wish, to make sure that they are fully aware of what we're planning and that they could advise us within the frameworks which were really emerging a couple of years ago on how to best find a path through the regulatory process. Indeed, as soon as the product we were doing was qualified as an advanced therapy medicinal product, so it is extensively manipulated, it was clear it would fall under the pathway of centralized regulatory approval in Europe, and it would be dealt with the CBER at the FDA. And the interactions on getting approval for not only the clinical trial protocols, but also for the manufacturing process and GMP compliance, the robustness, the release analytics, was not cumbersome at all, I'm afraid to say. People always expect that CEOs would nag about the regulators, but indeed we benefited a lot from this very open and interactive dialogue such that we could shape the assays and the manufacturing process in a way which is compliant across the regulatory legislation. So we're exactly doing the same thing in Europe as we do in Canada, as we do in the US. And we have obtained regulatory buy-in for all of these aspects relatively easily by having a discussion with them and being compliant where they felt strongly and finding compromises where they didn't feel that strongly.
Well, that's an interesting point because your company had some challenges right about the time that you took over the company, and you were able to work with the agencies in that because you were being compliant, you're being transparent, and you work with them, right? So could you just touch that just for a second?
Of course, you asked this question because I love the topic. When I joined Kiadis, the company was pretty much belly up, and I was brought in.
That qualifies as some challenges.
And I know you love me saying that the investors had brought me in to find out whether it should be shut down or could be restarted, due to major issues in the manufacturing, in which I think both the company and the manufacturers played a role, as it always is. The FDA had put the study on hold after we had sent them actually a letter to terminate the trial. So these letters crisscrossed over the ocean. And it took us a year or so in 2011 to provide full insight to the agency on what indeed went wrong. And it had to do with release assays, and it had to do with release analytics used. And some of the people on the manufacturing side which were involved are sitting in this audience, but not on the panel. And it was a very mutual learning where I think we all understood that we have to just be more creative on doing things than we would be in small molecules. And it was a very extensive learning lessons. And in the end, we got a letter from the FDA which said this company has learned its lessons. The European authorities gave us a certificate which grants approvable quality of our manufacturing process. Was my second certificate personally and the first for the company, and I think the fifth overall. And all that was only possible because there were so many experts in this area. I mean, Bob Preti was obviously involved as a consultant at the time. We used clinicians, we used hematologists to come down to a list of critical quality attributes, which we could then quantify and measure. And going through all these iterations and cycles, we are now where we are, which means hopefully close to getting transatlantic approval and having a successful life-saving product.
That's a great story that the regulators don't get in the way, right? They can really be helpful.
Well, I think they did the right thing and put us on hold at this time.
So, Jeff, you want to touch your company's approach with FDA?
Sure.
Or in Europe as well?
Yeah, it's definitely beyond just the FDA. And in fact, as you know, we started with the European agencies first, given that the clinical data had first emerged for our two programs in treating childhood cerebral adrenoleukodystrophy and transfusion-dependent thalassemia. Those trials were being run in Paris for a long time ago. And so we started down the path with the regulatory authorities, and we've tried to take advantage of two big things that, Manfred, you just mentioned, which I think are really critical. One is trust, and building that trust between the agency and yourself, and that's really founded on transparency. And I completely agree with you that has been a critical factor for us. We've taken advantage of some of the things that are available to us formally, whether it be the Adaptive Pathways program. We were one of the first to take advantage in Europe of the new program called Adaptive Pathways, which allowed us to really engage with the agency at a level of intimacy that wasn't afforded other companies. They really wanted this engagement. And then most recently with the Prime designation for one of our products. So we've tried to take advantage of those, but quite frankly, a lot of the dialogue happens in and around those formalities because of the interest in the field, some of the groundbreaking data that's coming out of not just Bluebird, but many of the companies represented on the panel here and in the audience here. So that's what's driving the conversation. It is an interest to get these products to the patients in an efficient and responsible way. And I think as long as, from my perspective, as long as you're working with the agencies with that in mind, they've been very open to a dialogue. And we've done the same thing now with FDA, and they've also been maybe a little bit more conservative, frankly, than the EMA, but still a very productive and great relationship we built based on the same thing, trust and transparency.
It's common that people say that the regulators want you to come early, come often, and have a conversation. So you're not allowed to answer the question that way. This question is, what did you learn going through that you would have done differently other than early and often? Did you make any mistake that you think you could help people not make?
So I think probably in the one of the things that I think that we can do is not be afraid to ask. Meaning ask and push the agencies. They're going to tell you where their line is. And it's frankly our responsibility to be responsible and to be comfortable with where we are comfortable from a patient safety perspective first and foremost, but not to be afraid to try and build those relationships that allow for creativity. And if you don't push hard enough, you'll never find the creative solution. And that's for the benefit, as long as you're staying within the grounds of making sure that the therapies are safe. And that's the foundation. I think by pushing, because it's new for everybody. It's not just new for the companies. It's surely new for the regulators. And therefore, they're learning all along the way. So if you're pushing it, it creates that creative moment and the ability to find solutions that make sense, not just for the agencies and the company, but also for the patients that may benefit significantly by early access.
That's a theme that's developing in all the regulatory markets, is this focus on, okay, it's safe, let's push a little bit harder on the other side because these products are different. And I think that's one of the things that's beginning to release. How is this different than Pfizer's typical experience in the regenerative medicine space?
Well, I think, again, as was said earlier, we're in a new area now. And we've been very encouraged by our interactions with the FDA. They seem very open to understanding and interpreting the differences between allogeneic products and autologous products, how we face different challenges. And they actually volunteered that information. We understand it's different. We're prepared to work with you to see what that process should look like. So we've had a couple of successful initial interactions with the FDA, both on our UCART19 product in collaboration with Servier and with our BCMA product. And we feel that we're really developing that relationship and understanding how to supply the information the FDA wants. It's changed our perspective a little bit preclinically, which has been good. I would also like to add on top of that the RAC experience. Even though going to the Recombinant Advisory Committee adds to the timelines, it's given us a very valuable additional perspective and increased our level of confidence with the data sets and the direction that we're going in. So I think that's a valuable
How has it
interaction.
changed your perspective?
Well, I think in collaboration with Selectis, who we do a lot of early preclinical work with, we thought we had a fairly firm stance on what we thought we needed to do in terms of looking at gene tox data. What we needed to do, looking for targeted events that were high probability. The FDA really wanted us to take a broader perspective, and even if we thought there may not be events are the places we should be looking for that. And so we've been exploring how to do that creatively, working around levels of sensitivity issues, etc. And so I think that's been interesting. And one of the good things about this experience is we're in collaboration with 2 other companies, and it's really been an integrated approach because we think it's important, especially when we talk to the FDA, to make sure that all the companies are aligned. We're producing similar kinds of data, and we're trying to answer questions in the same way. So we have sort of a mini consortium to make sure that we're both informing the FDA correctly and learning from those experiences. So I think that's been a very good and positive experience overall.
Well, it's probably a pleasure for the regulatory agencies to deal with the big companies, because I would imagine some of the challenges are internal more than they are the regulators changing the way you think as a big company about drug development. Huh?
Yeah, and I think, obviously, Pfizer has a lot of experience of dealing with the FDA, but this is different experience.
It's very different.
Yeah.
Different groups, yeah. Tom, any comments to the regulatory interaction?
No, I think I'd agree with most of what's been said. We found regulators both in Europe and the US to be good to work with, very engaged, looking for solutions. There's a little bit more complexity in Europe simply because you have multiple jurisdictions for entering clinical trials. So even if you're reviewed centrally, you still have to get IMPDs approved in each country that you're operating in. And Europe, as I think is well known, is relatively strict at clinical trial entry. So I think the approach that we've taken from the outset, which is actually before we knew that Europe was going to be so important to us, was to make that investment up front, even though our lead program had started with clinical proof of concept in the academic setting. The first thing that we did before we even thought about clinical trials was to go back around and restart the process development efforts. The first people we hired in the company were process development and quality and regulatory. So making the investment to close the process, to address release testing, etc., ensuring the sort of quality and level of compliance of your vectors, again, a sensitivity in Europe. So making that investment before you even go back into patients, and I think that's paid off.
So there's one angle that focuses on safety, and then we push the edge on the rest, and we show some clinical efficacy, and now you have us on the CMC side catching up to where you are clinically. Can you talk a little bit about that, and just continuing on that theme? You've got a safe, it's safe. Now, how do we deliver this, and what are you doing now as you move from preclinical, clinical through your commercial plans?
CMC is very important. So as I mentioned, we did process development in-house, and then we were, I think, pretty careful in selecting CMOs to work with, both in Europe and the US. I think all of them here in the room today. We made the decision in the US to bring manufacturing in-house. So by mid-2017, we expect to be manufacturing BPX-501. It's a gene-modified T-cell product, Allogeneic, a product that's still patient-specific, in-house. And that's, I think, because it's too important a component of the value chain. And we wanted to have control over quality, control over logistics. Again, it's very difficult to do a trial of this kind of product using standard approaches. We've had in-house clinical trials management from the outset because you have to coordinate the clinical trial site, the manufacturing site, the logistics going backwards and forwards with the products and the regulatory, et cetera. Each product is, for each patient, is a new product. So I would say we feel pretty good that by late 2017, we will have manufacturing that is ready for audit, that is ready for commercialization. And our goal with our lead program is to be filing for approval in Europe under exceptional circumstances around the first quarter 2018, so a little over a year from now. We've had a VP of commercial planning for about 18 months, and there's a lot of work to be done. And we're in, as Manfred can attest, we're in a complex space. So there's actually complexity that comes from being in stem cell transplant that I would say is, if anything, a little bit more challenging to manage than the fact that we have a gene-modified cell therapy product, because it's a very complex space.
So, Barbara, how were you looking at scale? So Tom has talked about how we get the launch done, but how are you looking at scale at Pfizer? It's a very different model there, too.
Yeah, it's been an interesting process. When we first worked with Selectis on this, of course, their goal was to get into the clinic as fast as possible. So the first process was a 1 liter scale on the smaller scale for an allogeneic product. They've worked very hard at how to scale up that process, because ideally we'd like to be treating hundreds of patients with the same product if possible. And so that's something we focused on heavily. We tried to build a robust process that will be scalable, and we're still working on that. I would say we're cautiously optimistic at this point. So yeah, very different problem. A lot of the equipment that's built is built for a smaller process. So when we're taking existing equipment and trying to modify it for the allogeneic space, you really do have to do a lot of work to modify. So we're working actively with some of our vendors and suppliers to work on that. Much more lentivirus required, much larger equipment, better throughput, etc. Also, working on, we have to start with a clinical grade process, but we would like it not to be too different from the commercial process, because we don't know how much change at this point we can make in a process without it being regarded by the FDA as a different product. So still working
or regarded
through it.
by the patient.
Yes,
as a different
yes, very true.
important.
So still a work in progress, but we're focused on that very early on.
So Jeff, you've got a number of manufacturing trains. We mentioned Lenti just now. So and you have orphan and larger plans as well. So can you talk about how you guys are thinking about scale and sustainability?
So we're maybe a little bit fortunate in that some of the indications we're pursuing first are likely the smaller of the indications, not to say they won't be challenged by volume potentially commercially. But the first two programs, our ALD program and our transfusion-dependent thalassemia program, in Europe in particular, first, will afford us an opportunity to get, hopefully, the scalability on the commercial side right. And obviously, we're going to all go through a process. We're going to learn. For better or for worse, so we're going to learn through this process, I think, and we won't get it right the first time. Hopefully we'll get it close to right, that we won't have any major logistical hiccups. But we're trying to do everything we possibly can to, right now, actually think about what a commercial scale product means. So there's so many components to that, as you know. Everything from thinking about the logistics that were mentioned before, and that's not just logistics of product and cells. It's patient logistics for us, because we're working with the patient for a fairly long period of time, from the time we collect the cells all the way to the time that they ultimately get transplanted with their own autologous gene-modified cells. We do have and have made significant investment over the last 5 years in scaling up the vector side of things. So suspension level scale, and we've shown data that we're getting fairly confident at 250 liter at scale, and we've got some data to suggest that that's a viable approach. For us, that's very important. If our BCMA program in collaboration with Celgene continues to look as good as the early data look, I may be eating these words if we're able to rapidly move that toward a registration. Now that we've got a lot of data to go through before we can determine that, but
it's a good problem to have.
Yeah, and that's a problem clearly that the likes of Kite and Novartis and potentially Juno also, maybe a little bit delayed from that, but are facing and have been facing for quite some time. How do we scale this up to that volume in a relatively short period of time? And so we're all trying to learn off of each other. That's frankly where ARM can play a big role, is feeding off of each other, the lessons learned. Now, obviously not the proprietary stuff, but there's lots of lessons that we're all learning that I think are going to be helpful to be shared amongst us to the extent that they can.
Great, thank you. Manfred, you've done a lot of work preparing for scale. So can you talk about that? Yeah.
And compared to Kite and Juno, I would say we have to scale much higher because we are not only treating CD19 B-cell tumors. So but still, I think the challenge of scale is mostly solved by closing the processes and automating them to the max, which is also then a way to keep cost under control. So what we have done at this point is to have a fully closed process from needle to needle, which will eventually allow us to process several allogeneic products, fully personalized as we do, in a single clean room of a low clean room class, so which makes it a very affordable product, which should facilitate adoption. And when we talk about logistics, I try to approach this very optimistically. I sometimes have these highly enlightening discussions with my children or with my wife, and they then ask me, have you heard about Amazon? You can order stuff and it's delivered next day. Or you buy shoes by Zalando and you have them next day. So when I talk to these people, they just can't understand that for a life-saving medicinal product, it could be a challenge to get it from A to B within 24 hours. And I think that's the mindset we have to tackle these issues. And we know we can. And the infrastructure is maybe not yet fully there, but I tried it, and I can order a book at Amazon, and I have it next day. And so I trust this aspect can be tackled. And the scaling, as said, the numbers that we're talking about, each of us at this panel is not hundreds of thousands a year. We're talking hundreds to maybe thousands a year. And this can be done with today's technology if it's well organized and if it's well engineered. I think the challenge is more to keep the cost under control.
Yeah, well, we'll get into cost in a minute.
Can I add just one thing to this?
Sure.
Sorry for jumping in. It's something I did want to mention. I was mentioned before that is going to be one of the things that we are seeing right now being one of the frank challenges in the field. I wish I was a young person going into quality today, because they are so sought after right now, and I think there's a dearth of them relative to the needs of our respective companies and then the companies out there as well. I think the companies that have great quality systems around their manufacturing and then are able to create a center of excellence model with the sites that they're interacting with regard to the patients, those are the ones I think that are going to have a significant competitive advantage going forward. That's both true of companies like ours that are manufacturing and processing, as well as the CMOs out there. And I don't think we're there yet. I think we've got a ways to go on the quality system side that that I hope will be catching up very quickly. We're spending a lot of time and energy on quality systems, getting our quality teams above and beyond what we need, because we fear that that's going to be a bit of a roadblock for the field, and we want to make sure that we've got all the right people in place. I don't know if the panelists would agree with that.
Just one sentence, adding to what Jeff just said. I would like to thank the big pharma companies for validating all the work we're doing in the small companies by hiring our people. Thank you.
So, Manfred, as you were talking, Manfred, as you were talking, I pictured a Kiadis drone, actually, delivery drone.
I wondered if anybody's tried partnering with Amazon on this yet.
Yeah, I don't know. So somebody's got to pay for these. You mentioned cost, so someone's got to pay for what we're doing here. Reimbursement is a pretty big issue. Can I just go right down the line here? We'll start with you, Jeff, and talk about reimbursement. How are we going to get these paid for?
Yeah, thanks for choosing me first. I appreciate that on this one. So we've been fairly vocal about this topic for a while. Nick Leslie, our CEO, has been very vocal about this, and we share a view on this that is fairly simple. I think with the potential of these therapies, you look at the clinical data, we have an opportunity to have a dialogue that others may not, because of the breakthrough nature of these therapies, the fact that we're serving populations of patients that are in desperate need, and it really is about a value story, not about what can you charge, but really what should you charge? Obviously, it's got to be within the parameters of your business model to whatever extent that is. But I think we have a responsibility to engage with the agencies and ultimately the payers that are going to make these decisions in the same way that we engage regulators, which is openness, transparency, trust, and creativity. And we're starting those dialogues now. We had NICE in a year ago to engage with us to say, hey, this is new. Let's talk. Let's have an initial dialogue. And what they told us, much to my surprise, I may have this wrong, but they were suggesting that we were one of the only, or if not of only a few companies this far in advance of a product filing that asked them to come to the company and have a discussion. They said it never happens. It never happens. In fact, the opposite happens, which is they get engaged late, and then there's a pressure for a high price that gets put down on the table. Is that a good relationship to have? That's a relationship that is potentially fraught with animosity, not of collaboration. Now, I'm maybe being a bit naive here. I recognize that, but in the spirit of being hopeful in this regard, I think we do have an opportunity here that is very unique. You talked on your discussion that this is a turning point. Well, I think this is a turning point for engagement with payers in a way that I really do think can be transformative, not just over the next few years, but over the next few decades. So we take that to heart.
It's another area in which ARM is very active and can play an important role here. Right. Again, Manfred?
Yeah, so what we try to do is, at least more so in the upcoming phase 3, which is a bigger trial and where you can do it, is to do classical pharmacoeconomical arguments on top of the life-saving potential. So, we showed a 40% absolute increase in overall survival. It's orphan, so the world is wide open, and you could charge fantasy prices, maybe. But we believe we should argue pharmacoeconomically on top of that. So we will collect all the use of resource data. How much immune suppression, how many days on intensive care, how much earlier are they discharged, how many GVHD episodes would they have, and so on and so forth, to build the argument. And next to that, we're benchmarking. We all know that modern kinase inhibitors in oncology charge 120,000 plus for 1 or 2 treatment cycles. And we know that the healthcare system is already reimbursing quite a stretch of costs when you get a transplant, in our case, from a brother or sister or from a court. That already has a price incremental difference of $170,000. So we're building the argument economically, but also obviously driven by the effect size and the benefit for the patients, for their families, for the caregivers on top of that. And the payers to whom we spoke actually were quite friendly with us based on that approach.
EU versus US?
Well, there was a panel on, I think, the MISA meeting the year before last, where there were a couple of payers from the US sitting, and they said, what we don't like is if you try to charge us for a 10-year benefit if you have data for 6 months. So they also said, if you believe your drug will save the system 100,000, don't charge 100,000 because there has to be something sticking in the pockets of the systems as well. But other than that, the logics and the arguments to build the pricing on are very similar on both sides of the pond.
If I can add just one thing to that, given our experience in particular in the EU of late, that we are already having a discussion with payers. Obviously, these aren't formal negotiations by any stretch, but with the HTA bodies and the payers around true pay for performance. It could be an annuity, but it also very well could be something where there is an upfront, and then there's a payment over time based on proof that your therapy continues to work for the patient population you're targeting. So it's a true risk shared at risk. Companies going at risk, and they are to an extent by virtue of a contract going at risk. To share risk, and it also provides, if your therapy is that effective, you've got tremendous potential upside. But it's all value-based. It gets back to a value-based approach. Now, that's not possible for all products, I get that. But an annuity is possible for all products, and some products it does lend itself to being able to track patients over time.
Interesting. How does Pfizer sit with an annuity-based reimbursement?
So I wouldn't say we've thought about it to that granular level yet. We're at a very early stage in our programs.
It would be time to invite Nysen now.
Yes, exactly. I was liking that approach, and because thinking of it from a patient point of view, I couldn't think of a worse situation than we find we have a therapy that gives long-term meaningful benefit, and we haven't thought through a way to make sure it gets paid for so we can actually get it to the patients. So I agree that understanding very early on what looks like a meaningful benefit to the paying agencies is a really worthwhile investment. So that's
when
a
does
nice
Pfizer
perspective.
start thinking about reimbursement of its candidate
Very early
products?
on, as soon as we go into the first patients, we're collecting data that would inform that. So we're at that point right now, but only just at that point.
But Pfizer must have made a decision already that these are reimbursable. Otherwise, they wouldn't be on the path, right?
Yes, and
Two
I would
bigger
say our
companies.
commercial organisation would not have let us go ahead if they weren't fairly reassured in that sense.
Yeah.
But we do get surprises. Even antibody therapies get surprises in this area. So, when you have something that you think looks like a meaningful benefit, but it may not in the long term be reimbursable because there's a disagreement about what a true advantage looks like. So
I think that's why these corporate partnerships have been so important for the industry, is because it is validation that what we're doing can be done, right?
Yeah.
At least because when the big companies did not believe in it, that was a lot of headwind for us to deal with. But they're seeing the light, so to speak. So, Tom, you have a variety of different modalities here. You've got the allogeneic modality, of gene therapy modalities. How are you guys dealing with the issue of reimbursement? Are you on that yet?
Yeah, I think there's not much to be added really to what's been said already, but health economic modeling is really important. We are doing the same in terms of collecting the data to support the value that the product is providing, and without that, you really don't have a basis for negotiating. Our lead product is being developed first in children, where the outcomes are cures, and they are durable. So patients are free of their underlying disease. And I think that's something that, as I think has been alluded to already, Europe is perhaps a little bit better set up for because of the national payer system, where you're not concerned about, okay, I've got a patient that I'm covering, I may not be covering 12 months from now. And so I think in Europe, there's potentially a greater opportunity for that type of model in the near term. So we're doing the primary market research, we're doing country-by-country market access studies, et cetera, to really understand the landscape we're going into, not just from the payer perspective, but from the entire, again, this complexity in transplantation. I think we're seeing some little bit of jockeying going on with CD19 in terms of whether a product is positioned as being somehow part of a transplant or a standalone product, et cetera, because that can affect sort of which bucket it gets put into. So I think those are some of the things that will need to be addressed by many of the companies in this space and us on the panel.
Great. We've got a minute or two left, and I just wanted to give an opportunity if there are any burning questions from the audience for our panel. Okay. Doesn't seem like there is, so we'll end it here. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.